and just welcome everyone. We will be discussing how we go about harnessing the power of sun, wind, and geothermal. I'm Ben Ebenhack. I'm chair of the Department of Petroleum Engineering and Geology at Marietta College in Ohio. We have our panelists, Dr. Roland Horne at Stanford University, Dr. Habib Dagher at the University of Maine, and Jay Warmke with Blue Rock Station, which is involved in solar power. Each of us will be presenting views on this part of the transition, and I will be moderating. I'm going to start with a few slides to, I hope, set the stage for the discussion that is to follow. So, first of all, I want to look at global power usage. This diagram is actually from 2005, which I used in a number of publications, drawn from BP's annual energy outlook. And want to point out that at the time, 86% of world energy came from fossil fuels. Of the 14% that was non-fossil, 41% was nuclear, 27% biomass, and that's raw biomass, firewood and dung primarily. Charcoal actually counts in this as well. Hydropower, and 9% of that 14% was the rest of the picture. Geothermal at the time was 17% of that fraction. Wind was 27%. Solar heating, 41%. Solar photovoltaics, what most people like to think of as solar, was only 3% of 9% of 14% at the time. Biofuels was another 12% of that. Now, updating the global energy mix to 2020, we see that the total fossil share has declined a little bit from 86% to 79%. Of the non-fossil energy mix, the other renewable has increased to 20% of total global market share. And some good news in this, wind and solar together combined grew from a total of 0.38% of the global mix to 2.18%. So they have both been growing pretty rapidly. Of concern, though, on these graphs, I want to point out that even with this growth in non-combustion renewable energy systems, the share of traditional biomass, firewood, charcoal, dung, grew from 3.7% to 6.8%. These are the dirtiest and most hazardous sources. So in a number of ways, we've moved back, or at least in this way, I should say, we've moved backwards. Half of the world's population, about 3.5 billion people, currently depends on biomass fuels as their primary energy. The numbers will likely increase. The World Health Organization estimates that cooking over open wood fires daily is responsible for about 4 million deaths per year. And the image is one fuel wood market in the capital city, Ouagadougou, capital of Burkina Faso. So even with the progress that we've seen lately, we've still got quite a road ahead of us in terms of the change in energy mix. And wind and solar and geothermal are probably the cleanest of the options that we have. And I think that's what we need to look at today and see what their challenges and opportunities are. So I'm going to stop my share and turn it over to Dr. Horne for his background presentation.
Thank you. So let me go ahead then and talk about geothermal in the context, actually, as you've just heard, in the overall mix of renewable energy and actually all energy. So first of all, just a quick snapshot of where the world is in geothermal energy, at least from the point of view of electricity. This is a snapshot from 2020. The figures there shown for 2025 is a projection. So in 2020, the world in general was producing about 16,000 megawatts of electricity from geothermal sources. And if you want to find out where it's actually being generated regionally, there are two papers from the World Geothermal Congress 2020, which show the updates from 89 countries. There were also updates made in the World Geothermal Congress in 2023. I'm not sure if they're yet online, but anyway, they should be very soon, if not now. So we take a look at how the world is growing. I showed you the overall figures, but actually it's quite regional in terms of expansion. And in the last 5 years or so, in particular, there are 3 countries that have made very dramatic increases in their geothermal production, namely Indonesia, Turkey, and Kenya. And importantly, Indonesia used to be number 3 in the world, but in the last 5 years, they overtook the Philippines to become number 2. And you can see there the top 10 led by the United States. And importantly, there Turkey, which is now number 4, 10 years ago, didn't appear on this list at all. And this is a wider list showing all of the nations that have added electricity. So you can see the 3 that I pointed out. But then I've also, being from the United States, pointed out that the US is also continuing to expand, although not at the rate of those other 3 countries. And if we look in terms of how much has been added in the countries that did increase between 2015 and 2020, I draw attention to Kenya, which added 600 megawatts. And the reason for focusing on Kenya is that Kenya doesn't have a particularly large national grid, and the addition of 600 megawatts is a substantial fraction of their overall generation. So if we take a look at the world in terms of how much of the electricity in any given nation which is generated from geothermal, you can see there Kenya at the top of the list. These are figures from 2019. In 2019, Kenya was generating nearly 50% of all of its electricity from geothermal sources. But you can see many other countries there that are producing substantial fractions of their electricity from geothermal. You know, a third, a quarter is not uncommon. Now, switching my focus to the United States, and I'm going to talk for the remainder of the time about the context of how geothermal and other renewable sources fit together. This is a map of the last 20 years or so of renewable energy in the United States. Again, still talking about electricity. The blue is hydro, and the yellow is wind, and the red is solar. So you can see that actually at the current time, wind has actually now gone past hydro in overall generation, and solar is also expanding, but starting at a later time. Sorry. And changing my focus even smaller, this is looking at the state of California, which is where I am right now. And this is a picture of the renewable generation in our state for the last 40 years or so. And what you can see here in this red band, you can see how important geothermal has been to electricity generation in the state of California. Starting around 2010, we have this rapid increase of wind. And starting in around 2015, the rapid increase of solar, which now actually occupies the top spot in generation. And just to be clear here, the solar is divided in two parts here, the yellow and the orange. BTM solar stands for behind the meter solar. So these are individual panels that people have on the tops of their houses that are not grid connected, or at least not supplying to the grid in normal circumstance. The orange is the utility connected solar. So geothermal in the 1990s was the principal source of renewable electricity in the state of California. And it's smaller today as a fraction, but still remains an important component. And that, of course, as you just heard from Ben, is important because wind, nuclear, and geothermal actually are numerically the smallest carbon emitters in terms of life cycle emissions. So if we look focus in a bit on not only California, but Nevada as well, currently geothermal is the source of 6% roughly of all of the electricity generated in the state of California. And more importantly still is it's 9.4%, actually it was 9.7% in 2022 in the state of Nevada, our neighboring state. And that's a particularly important number because of the fact that in the state of Nevada, their geothermal resources are actually rather lower temperature than we have in California. So the fact that Nevada, mostly due to fortunate geology, but a more progressive legislature actually, have promoted the development of geothermal in that state. So looking at the mix of electricity again in our state now as a function of time, you can see the growth of wind and solar up here, and the reduction over time of hydro. We used to have 2 nuclear plants in the state. One of them shut down in 2011. Now we have only 1. But they're rather slow and steady. At the bottom there is geothermal, which has maintained a steady position as a reliable source for the whole of that time. Excuse me. And one of the characteristics that we have, which is not necessarily the case everywhere, the state of California is quite often subject to drought. And what you can see in terms of our total hydro generation in these specific years that you see there is extremely variable. So although we always imagine wind and solar to be variable on a 24-hour cycle, hydro is also variable on more like a 5-year cycle in the state of California, at least. And the consequence of that actually is important to the way that the California electricity grid works. So we were looking at multiple years. This is just looking at 24 hours of the day. And obviously in the middle of the day, we have a large input from renewables, principally solar. And the other sources of electricity have to make up the difference to the total demand. So you see, this is a snapshot of a single day from last summer. At that particular day, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 43% of the electricity in the state was being generated from renewable sources, not including hydro, which is not characterized that way in our state. And you can see how that mixture came about. And looking at it on a slightly different point of view, you can see then looking at the renewables, it happens, at least on this particular day, and also not uncommonly in California, that the wind blows more at night. Not always, of course, but that's, as you see, a fairly typical pattern on this particular day. That's very advantageous because it backfills what is lost when the solar goes down, when the sun also goes down. But then importantly, what you see at the bottom is this characteristic of geothermal, which it remains basically base load all of the day. And this is a point that I want to make, which is a challenge for the future of geothermal, is that in a high variable mix, such as what you see here in California, baseload power is actually not convenient for the grid. So you've all seen, I'm sure, this so-called duck curve. So this is a daily image, a 24-hour image of the demand for electricity in our state, typically looking a bit like a duck. And the difference between the total demand and the net demand is everything basically which is not wind and solar, actually is very substantial, and it changes in a very significant way during the day. So in the middle of the day, we quite often have an excess of electricity. Sometimes the price goes negative. Solar sometimes has to be curtailed. But between 2 o'clock in the afternoon and 7 o'clock at night, which is the peak demand, actually the state of California has to add 13,000 megawatts to make up for the loss of the variable load. And obviously, actually, geothermal is not particularly convenient from that, because the way that the plants actually operate and the way that the geothermal reservoirs operate, they actually want to be running all of the time. They're very much like nuclear from that point of view. So the challenge in the future is how to adapt the technology to make geothermal power more easily dispatchable. Yeah. So I have a couple of slides left. The way that that's currently being handled in the state of California is with the use of storage. So we have quite significant battery storage, and I'll show you the distinction between 2018 and 2022. In 2018, you can see that the way that the battery storage was used was charging and discharging actually on a quite frequent basis, even down to the 10-minute level. And that was used to actually moderate the frequency control of the grid. And you can see here the maximum generation in 2018 on that particular day was about 90 megawatts. But shifting to 2022, also just one particular day, you can see it's a very different picture altogether. Now the batteries are used in much the way that you might imagine them to be. They're charged during the daytime when there's plenty of cheap solar available, and they're discharged in the afternoon to make up that deficiency as the demand goes up and the variables go down. And you can see on this particular day, there were 2,000 megawatts at a peak being added to the grid from battery storage. And that contrasts to 90 megawatts that you saw in 2018. And the same is true in other states as well. This is the United States total of grid scale battery storage. And about a third of this actually in 2021 is actually in the state of California. So just a summary then. Since 2005, there's a lot of new countries have joined the geothermal community. There are several countries which importantly increase their geothermal production in a significant way, some of them to the point of achieving nearly 50% of their total electricity requirement. That's been made possible by a lot of new technologies I don't have time to talk about, at least right now. It might come up in the questions. I talked about lower resource temperatures. Both Turkey and Nevada are examples of places where they were able to recover electricity from lower temperature geologies than formerly was considered to be kind of attractive. And as I pointed out, achieving dispatchability is a new technology target for our industry. So with that, I will conclude and turn it back over to you, Ben.
Thank you. I know I learned some things already there. And I wonder if you would just add a few words, Roland, for the people who may confuse geothermal with geothermal. Since we, in my opinion, kind of unfortunately use that both to refer to power generation and heat pump technologies. And I'm hoping we have a reasonably informed audience, but for those who may be confused by that distinction, I wonder if you could add a few words about that.
Yes, I haven't had time to talk about direct use and heat pumps, but actually those are both very important applications of geothermal as well. And in fact, in total of all of the energy mix planet-wide, about as much geothermal is used for direct heat and heat pumps as is the amount I just showed you for electricity. So what I've told you is basically half of the story, focusing on electricity only. And my only excuse, I'm sorry, is that that's the part of geothermal that I work on.
Right. Well, Yeah, I brought it up because I've encountered people who just don't even understand that there's anything besides direct heat for it. Would you say that Iceland dominates that direct heat use? That's my somewhat uninformed impression.
Actually, number one in the world is China.
Okay. Yet another new piece of information for me. Thank you. So I think we'll turn it over to Jay. I see that Habib Dagher has joined us, but we'll also give him a few minutes to collect his wits before joining in the conversation. Jay?
Okay, well, thank you, Ben, and I thank Roland for making part of the case for solar for me. I appreciate that. I know we're not debating one technology over the other, but I wanted to just acknowledge that. From the standpoint of a viable technology, solar, I always like to say, is pretty much just a teenager. If you look at the price per watt on a typical solar panel, even though the technology has been around for a while, back in the 1970s, the price per watt for a panel was a little over $100 a watt, and that would mean that a 250 watt panel would have cost right around $25,000. So that was very much an impractical technology. As we move forward today, that same 250 watt panel is going to cost you in the neighborhood of $100. So at some point, there's a price point, and we can see from this graph, it was somewhere around 2007 or so, where the costs became attractive and we began to see that growth taking off. The orange there is the cost decline, and the blue is the installation as that grows. And as was pointed out earlier, this was coming from basically almost nothing, a very small amount of solar. In fact, the prices have declined so much when you talk about solar panels that we're not really talking anymore about price per watt for solar panels. A few years ago, that was the way we measured price declines. Today, we really talk about systems as far as the cost per watt installed. And these costs per watts installed are typically pre-incentive costs. So basically full cost on these systems. And for retail solar, that price has declined really all the way down in the last couple of years. The average for a retail installation is about $3 a watt. We did see a little bit of a price increase due to some supply chain issues coming in the post-COVID world. So it bumped back up a wee little bit, but now really the first quarter of this year, we're starting to see it stabilize again and come back to a decline. And I guess I'm pointing out some of these price issues because I think it's important for folks to think about solar not so much like a traditional energy source. I like to think about it like microprocessing, the cost. It almost is more of a Moore's law kind of situation as opposed to something that is an extraction economy where there's a fixed limited amount of this. And of course, the more you extract it, the more expensive it gets. Over time, we've been used to energy getting more and more expensive. With solar, this is a bit more disruptive because the technology is such that the prices continually decline, and we're seeing this being pushed and pushed pretty aggressively. I suspect there's a floor somewhere, but we haven't reached that floor yet. And this is really the driving force behind the rapid adoption of solar is that the prices are just simply so attractive. But when we talk about solar, most people think about solar on their homes, perhaps solar on their business. But really where most of the growth has been here in the United States anyway, is really in the utility scale. On the utility side of the meter, this graph here, if you look at the light blue at the top, that's the percentage of the installed base that is actually utility scale. We tend to break the solar market into a number of different segments. They're indicated here. There's residential solar. That's what most people are thinking about on their homes and the like. Then there's commercial and industrial, and that's becoming ever more popular, largely because there are quite a number of tax incentives for businesses to install solar at the moment. A lot of them came from the Inflation Reduction Act. So this is something that's prevalent here in the United States, and it's driving that market segment. And then, of course, there's community solar. Community solar is something that's very, very popular, where only perhaps 50% of the homes are suitable for solar. There are trees, there's the wrong orientation. The homeowner, it may not be owner occupied. So the customer is the landlord's not going to install solar if they're not paying the electric bill, things like that. Or the client, the people may not be credit worthy. So then you can get a community solar system where there's a large system installed and people purchase a portion of that system, and then the production is allocated back to their home or business. That requires a certain amount of utility cooperation, and the utilities have been somewhat resistant to some of this expansion of solar. I like to quote the Gandhi quote where he said, first they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they attack you, and then you win. Well, we're going to win, but we're being attacked a little bit at the moment. Before it was kind of like, who cares? They're Prius driving whatevers, and they don't care. Now, I truly believe distributed energy is an existential risk to the traditional solar or to the traditional utility companies. They're simply going to have to change their business model. And I think I would love us to get a little bit of discussion about how utilities are going to move forward and change from their traditional centrally operated, regulated to basically virtual utilities. The utility of the future is going to look more like Facebook than it's going to look like a utility that we see today. So when we look at the newly installed, and again, these are grid generating systems, just 10 years ago, it was a battle between coal, natural gas, and utility scale wind. Those were the three dominant technologies. But if we move forward just 10 years, now we see that new additions to the grid here in the United States are substantially dominated by solar. We see right at around 50% of all new additions to the grid are solar, and it's really now a battle between solar, wind, and natural gas. And the reason why natural gas has displaced coal is primarily one of economics, but all fossil fuels at their heart are stored sunlight. And the problem that we have with wind and solar is that it's intermittent. It produces when it produces. And so the beauty of fossil fuels and nuclear and the like, and geothermal, is that it is dispatchable when it's needed as opposed to when it's available. But we're beginning now to see that there is a new player in the mix, and that is utility scale battery. And it's becoming a significant portion of new energy sources that are being placed onto the grid. And part of the reason for that, I'll get in that in a second, but again, the reason why solar is dominant at the moment for new energy sources, once again, is it comes back to simple economics. If you look at this chart here, the yellow indicates the cost, the levelized cost of solar. And then we see the blue is the levelized cost of wind. And then the gray and the black levelized cost of coal and natural gas. And if we sort of scan in on this, you'll see that in just the last couple of years, really 2017, the levelized cost of solar fell below that of pretty much all of the other alternatives. Wind and solar are onshore wind is competitive with solar as well. So those are the two dominant. And in fact, according to FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, all of the applications for new power that's going onto the grid over the next 5 years, of those applications, 95% of them are wind and solar. So the transition away from fossil fuels as the primary new source of energy has occurred within this country and in most of the industrialized countries in the world. But there is still an embedded base of these fossil fuel generating plants, and they're not going away until they're either no longer economically competitive with the alternative, or they reach their sell-by date, basically. And of course, the lithium prices have again created this dramatic rise in battery storage technology. So what we're seeing is that utility scale and at the individual homeowner, they can deal with the intermittency of solar and wind by simply storing it when they have it and using it when they don't have those energy sources. And the price decline there with lithium has shown that same kind of curve that we saw with solar, where as prices decline over time, you reach a tipping point, and it appears to me anyway from this diagram, that's around 2016, where the prices became competitive enough that the adoption of that technology really takes off. And we're going to see this same kind of exponential growth within battery storage that we've seen over the last 6 or 7 years with solar energy. And one of the questions is, okay, where is this going to go? Who is going to dominate worldwide? And I found it interesting from the International Energy Agency. They're really projecting that as we move forward over the next few years, and this is happening very, very quickly, but you will see that solar by the year 2027 is projected to become the top source of electrical energy worldwide. So that's quite a dramatic change. And I guess we need to lay on top of this. I've been talking about electricity for the most part, but we're also undergoing this dramatic change worldwide again, moving towards the electrification of pretty much everything. The electrification of vehicles, that is going to have a significant impact on the petroleum industry that has been the dominant fuel source in that market share. I like to think of energy usage a lot of times as a third of it is buildings and structures. That's primarily electricity. A third of it, industry, primarily has been natural gas, and then transportation. So that's primarily been petroleum. All of these are rather rapidly moving towards electricity, the electrification of everything. So we'll have to see how that plays out. And one question that is often raised is there the capacity, the manufacturing capacity to deal with this rapid transition from where we've been to where we're going? And there was a recent study just this week that was published that shows that they are anticipating, based on the announced projects, that actually solar is in pretty good shape as far as manufacturing capacity. This was a study done by the EIA again, the IEA, and it's saying that in order to get to a net zero carbon emission by 2050, we have some interim goals on manufacturing capacity by 2030. So where do these industries stand in meeting those interim goals for production of the components that are going to be necessary to make this happen. And solar is already at 130% of what it anticipates it needs. Of course, some of these are simply announced projects, and we'll see if they're actually built. Battery technology also in pretty good shape. Hydrogen, I'm not very keen on hydrogen, and it's probably a very small number. But then wind and heat pumps, as was mentioned earlier, looks like there's going to be some manufacturing capacity issues. So that's going to have to ramp up pretty rapidly to deal with it. So what countries are dominating? I think we'll keep hearing China. China dominates in many aspects of solar and energy, geothermal, as we just heard. One of the interesting changes here domestically has been that the United States, up until really last year, relied upon Chinese manufactured solar products, primarily the solar panels. About 85% of all of the panels used in the US were manufactured through Chinese firms. They moved them through a couple of countries in Southeast Asia to avoid some tariffs, but that hasn't worked very well. And so anyway, then tax policies just recently have changed that to where the Inflation Reduction Act, there are so many manufacturing facilities being announced in the United States that it is anticipated now that about 90% of all of the domestic need will be filled from domestically manufactured solar panels within just 3 years. So that transition has gone from being import dependent to being domestically provided in a period of about 3 to 4 years, which is pretty dramatic. And the United States, that model is being emulated in Europe, in many of the other nations. So I suspect we're going to see this where there's a rush towards domestic manufacture of these critical components, not only in energy, but in microchips and things like that. And I suspect also in about 5 years, we're probably going to see a glut of panels on the market because people tend to overdo things. So we'll see an excess of capacity. And another interesting aspect of solar per se is it is a very labor-intensive industry. And so we are seeing that solar employs more people than any other technology as far as energy generation. Now, this does not include extraction, but this is energy generation. Solar dominates, followed by wind as far as that. And so we're actually anticipating that we're going to need to have a huge number of folks added to the workforce. And that's one of the challenges the industry faces is how are we going to find and recruit these people? And you do see from these diagrams that residential solar, the small scale solar, is the most labor intensive portion of that. In fact, this chart is just showing that by the year 2035, it really is anticipated we may need to triple the workforce in order to meet the set goals that are in place today. And I think that's it for my little plug.
Well, thank you very much, Jay. That was, I think, a lot of good information, a lot of information that is in many ways more current than I've been able to keep up with. And you've pretty directly addressed one of my biggest reservations about the growth of solar in terms of manufacturing. But I'd like to see if we can dig a little deeper into that one, because your graph showing the committed and announced projects, 2030 is not very far away. And it seems to me, as an engineer, I just have a hard time picturing that announced but uncommitted factories are going to be built within the next 7 years. Can you shed any more light on that concern?
I think it's a valid concern, but we're seeing these things happen so dramatically, largely because there are a lot of incentives to do so. There are production credits that are part of the Inflation Reduction Act. So the manufacturers are actually having their production subsidized. And so we've seen announcements. For example, there's a large facility that was announced about a year and a half in Dalton, Georgia, that would basically double production within the United States, and it is now producing. So it was announced a year and a half ago. It is now up and running. There's huge amounts of solar in the state of Ohio. Ohio is one of the dominant producers worldwide of solar panels. And for example, First Solar up near Toledo, they've expanded about fivefold over the last year because their production is already sold out through 2028. So they're just saying, okay, let's just throw money at this. There's a huge plant that's opening up near Columbus, and this is happening everywhere. And like I said, I think the big problem is going to be in a couple of years oversupply. And we're not seeing the dumping of imported panels, largely because the tariffs that were put in place during the Trump administration have continued on. So there's a 25% hit if you import Chinese or Chinese panels here in the U.S., and there is a 10% tax credit if you purchase American-made solar panels. So all of the incentives are in place to make this thing happen really, really fast.
Cool. That's really interesting. Could you say a word about mining in terms of the materials? Do you see any risk of a choke point there?
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion about that. Of course, silicon is the major component, and it is the most abundant mineral on the planet. Mm-hmm. But it is also, that particular process is pretty energy intense because you're essentially melting silicon. So there's a lot of energy there. So there's been a transition away from silicon towards perovskite. It's another mineral process, and they're getting to the point where some of these solar panels can be essentially 2 atoms thick. You can get a layer of perovskite, and it's almost an inkjet printing process. The biggest component concern is the aluminum for the frame, the silver that is the wiring on the face. A significant amount of the silver that's mined here and used in the United States goes towards solar panels. It's significant, I'd like 20%. And then let's see, it's primarily, and copper. So those are the things, the aluminum, copper, silver, those are going to be the barriers to the expansion. But we're also starting to see folks moving away from those materials, trying to minimize the amount. The balance there is these systems are typically designed to last in the field for 25 years. And if you make them less robust by minimizing the structural material, then you're going to find failures in the future. So that's kind of the balance that we're at the moment, but we're certainly not running out of materials there, but like the cost of copper has gone crazy in recent years, so that's added a significant amount to the cost of the system. The solar, the electronics, and the panels keep getting cheaper and cheaper, and the labor and the sort of non-sexy materials like aluminum and copper keep getting more and more expensive. So that's the balance that we're dealing with there.
Thank you very much. I think that's very, very significant. So I think that Dr. Habib Dagher has had a few minutes and can close the loop of talking about wind in this mix that we're talking about today. Are you ready for me to turn it over to you?
I am ready. Thank you, Ben. And it was a they're very informative presentations from the rest of the team here. So let me share my screen if that would work. So. Do you see my screen?
Yep. Yeah.
Very good. Let me preface this by saying that society needs all the above in many ways. I think solar and wind and geothermal and hydro and others, other renewable sources are key for us to combat climate change and be able to have a cost-effective system. And I'd like to preface also that depending on where you are in the world, you may have a more abundance of one source than the other. So geographic location can also determine in many ways what you use, what you don't use. I'm going to focus my work, because that's what we do at the University of Maine, on talking to you about floating offshore wind technology, which is the next generation offshore wind. Of course, there's a lot of land-based wind out there, but many of us who live in coastal areas and coastal states have a wonderful resource closer to our big cities than land-based wind. If you're also constrained geographically, such as you may be in New York or in Massachusetts, in Boston, and other places, offshore wind is the wind that you have access to closer to the population and the loads that you need to serve. Offshore wind is not as big as land-based wind right now. The majority of installations in the world are land-based wind installation, but offshore wind is moving forward at a rapid pace. And one of the key technologies within offshore wind is floating wind technologies. So when you go to floating wind, floating turbines, if you have water depth more than about 50 meters. And that represents about 2/3 of the offshore wind resource across the globe. So it's an important resource, and there's an international race right now to develop floating wind technologies. To give you a sense of what a floating wind turbine looks like, here's what one of the many designs are out there, and that's a design developed here at the University of Maine. It's called the semi-submersible. And what you see in yellow is above the water, what you see in gray is below the water. And to give you a sense of scale, I don't know if you see, but where my cursor is, there's a school bus. So these are not very tiny units. Today, the largest offshore wind turbine in the world is 16 megawatt capacity. The blades are bigger than a football field per blade. So these are very big machines. And there are designs right now being developed for even bigger turbines that are in the 20 to 25 megawatt range. So these are very big units. Because they float, you could fabricate them dockside and then tow them out to sea and put them beyond the horizon. And in many places in the world, the farther out you are from shore, the more consistent the wind is and the steadier the wind is. A bit about how a turbine floats. Essentially, there's air inside the hull that makes it float. There's different designs. Because the hull floats, you have mooring lines to keep it on station. In this case, notice there are 3 mooring lines in each corner of this floating turbine. There are 3 flotation columns, 1 in each corner. These are, in our case, we make them out of concrete, but they're filled with air. And that's what gives it the flotation capacity. Under the water, there are 3 beams that connect the 3 columns together to form a floating turbine. Now, the cable comes out from under the turbine, and it's called a dynamic cable. And it has buoyancy modules on it, and then it's fixed to the seabed afterwards. The reason you do that is to allow the cable to follow the hull as the hull moves around. A bit about Maine in the United States. So for those of you who don't know where Maine is, we're the northeast state in the United States, and we're part of New England. And this is what New England looks like. Mass and Maine, of course, New York is added here. And there's a shot of Maine. And we have 2 ongoing projects this decade on floating wind. One will go off Monhegan Island, Maine, and one will go, that's a single turbine. And then a bigger research array is going to go off off the coast of Maine at the end of the decade is a 150 megawatt unit. This is our research center, and to give you a sense of how we research offshore wind and wind energy, this is an example of one of our test facilities at the university. And this is a wind blade that's being tested under fatigue loads. As we're building and designing bigger and bigger turbines, the fatigue performance of these turbines is very important. You can actually test the fatigue performance of these turbines in a test like that within 2 months and be able to replicate 20 to 30 years of service. We also have built facilities. We call it the wind wave basin. It's a facility that has a wave basin and a wind tunnel on top of one another, and that's the first facility in the U.S. of its kind that we built to basically help develop offshore wind turbine technologies. And in this case, we can create windstorms over wave storms. Here's an example of the facilities that we've been building to develop floating wind turbine technologies. So you could see here we can create waves of different frequencies, and then you could see in the background a wind tunnel that allows us to actually create wind shear and change wind speeds with height and change wind direction versus waves and so on and so forth. And what you see right here is a floating turbine being tested under combinations of winds and waves. That's an example of the kind of tests we do to move this technology forward globally. Now, going back to the U.S. briefly, if you look at around the U.S. coast, the statistic is really interesting and important, is that there's enough offshore wind capacity within 50 miles of the U.S. coast to power the country 4 times over. And about 80% of our population lives in coastal states. So this is an example of where you have a technology or a resource that sits next to major cities on the coast of the country, and that can be part of the solution towards the future. Not the only solution, but certainly part of the solution. And what you see in light blue and dark blue are shallow water areas and dark and deep water areas. The light blue areas are shallow water. And can you see my cursor at all? I don't know if you can, but
Yes, I can.
thanks. So the shallow water areas are light blue, and what you see in dark blue are water depth of 50 meters or more. And anytime you see dark blue areas, you have to float the turbines because it's too deep to fix the turbine to the seabed. So in the U.S., 2/3 of the offshore wind resource is in deep water where you need floating turbines. And the U.S. government last year called floating wind the 5th U.S. Earth shot. In other words, a key technology to meet our climate goals and our energy security goals. So now that doesn't mean that solar isn't important or hydro isn't important or geothermal isn't important. It's just one of the many solutions that society has to help solve its energy and climate issues. This is a shot of the east coast of the United States showing where offshore wind farms plan to be built. And the U.S. government has a goal of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, which will bring roughly about $100 billion of investment into the country and 44,000 jobs. The majority of these, I would say all of them right now are on the East Coast, but the West Coast is going to start soon going to floating turbines because the West Coast is all in deep waters. The global pipeline for floating wind last year was roughly over 100 gigawatts, 120 gigawatts, which would require $500 billion of investment to build. And notice it's quite well distributed across the globe. So floating wind will be one of the other solutions that your generation will be seeing as we help combat climate change. There are different ways to float a turbine, and there's an international race, if you wish, to develop different technologies. As far as I know, there's more than 80 technologies out there. You could see different designs of floating turbines, but typically they all share one thing: they float. You fabricate them dockside or tow them out to sea and moor them to the seabed. And there's different ways to design them and to moor them. But what's interesting is the technologies have been borrowed from the oil and gas industry. Oil and gas platform designs have been converted to hold up floating wind turbines. And these are different designs of floating turbines that you could see out there. How do you moor them to the seabed? You use mooring lines, and they're typically made out of steel chains or out of synthetic mooring ropes. But notice these are not tiny. These are very big steel chain sections and very big rope sections. The other thing is how do you connect an offshore wind farm electrically to the coast? Each turbine that floats has a cable coming down from it, and typically it forms this lazy S wave with buoyancy modules on it to allow the electrical cable to follow the hull as it moves around. Of course, it doesn't move around as far as it wants. It moves around roughly in a watch circle that might be anywhere from 20 to 40 meters in radius. And so the cable has to follow it as it moves around. But eventually what you do to bring the power to shore, you have arrays of turbines, typically in 3, 4, or 5, or 10 back to back, about a mile apart. And each turbine will have a cable coming out of it, and they're basically daisy chains. And eventually each row of turbines has a cable coming from it to an offshore substation, and then you bring an export cable back to shore. And it's typically buried under the seabed. So the cables between the turbines are called inner array cables, and the cables that connect a complete farm to shore are called export cables. And the farms have been built over 20, 30 miles offshore, depending on where you are, around the world. And finally, here in Maine, we have a plan to bring floating wind to the state and beyond. But the plan is, we call it 110-100. In other words, crawl before you walk, walk before you run. So we've put one turbine in the water back 10 years ago, and we're going to put 2 more by 2026, and then 10 more between 29 and 2030. And then starting at the next decade, we go to gigawatt scale commercial farms. This is the very first grid-connected offshore wind turbine in the U.S. We built it in our laboratory. It was a 1:8 scale version of a larger unit. You could see what it looks like. It was all fabricated onshore and in pieces and assembled and towed down. In this case, a river, the Penobscot River in Maine. It was a 10-hour-long tow. You could see the hull completely assembled. When it got to its final position, it was moored to the seabed. The mooring lines were pre-installed. We had a pre-installed electrical cable that we hooked up, and that's how we ran the unit. Here's what it looked like 10 years ago off the coast of Maine. And that's the unit over on the left-hand side. And the cable came to shore. And this was a test unit. And the last slide I show you what it looked like in a 50-year storm. That's relative to the size of the hull. In the Gulf of Maine, it's roughly about a 20-meter wave from peak to trough. Relative to the size of the hull, it's a 50-year storm. And you could see the size of the white caps here versus the size of the unit. What you see blowing across is snow. That's not really good. That's a snowstorm. But you could see that the hull doesn't really move in a 50-year storm. And that's really what we're trying to prove, is we have a technology that can survive 50 and 500-year storms. So that was a successful, very successful test, which now allows us to move forward with this technology at a larger scale. But there's other tests like that took place across the world. So there are a number of opportunities with floating wind across the globe. As we said, 80% of the world population lives in the U.S. population lives in coastal states. Offshore wind is very close to the large population centers, large and big cities. Off the U.S. and the world coast. So we see offshore wind, floating wind to be an important part of the solution going towards the future. But what we need, though, to make all this happen is really develop a supply chain. You've heard some questions about supply chain that need to be developed in the U.S. and globally. But we also need to develop port facilities to help us build this infrastructure and deploy it and maintain it. And these port facilities that can do that don't exist across the world yet, but there's plans across the world to go ahead and build these ports that can fabricate these hulls and tow them out to sea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that was also a fascinating presentation. And if you'll forgive me, I'd like to start with a couple of simple questions that come from some level of ignorance, in your 50-year storm video, was it generating power through that, or was it freewheeling?
We did it both ways. Typically what you want to do when you get a 50-year storm, if you wish the design of the unit, you basically shut it down and freewheel it. But in our case, we tried both because we're trying to exercise the numerical models to see if they worked. So we did freewheel it. We also generated energy at the same time. But of course, when you do that, you got to be careful. You have to pitch the blades in such a way that you don't overload the turbine. So we did pitch the blades so that we can manage the loads on the turbine and on the system in that storm, and that's how we ran it. So,
and that worked. There were no particular failures with even that
correct
level of load.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so that kind of leads me to my other somewhat uninformed question. My casual observation is that we went from a lot of high RPM, low torque turbines in the late 70s, 80s to mostly high torque, low RPM. Am I correct in that? And is that a major factor in reduced failure and impact on wildlife and so on?
Well, yes, you're right. We have essentially the RPMs could be 12 to 15 RPMs, revolutions per minute on most of these big turbines. So they don't, in terms of an RPM, they don't move very quickly. But if you go to the tip of these turbines, you don't want to be anywhere near that. Okay. Because these turbines, the tip of the turbines, because of the size, again, you're looking at bigger than a football field. Even at 12 RPMs, you've got some very big speed, so you don't want to be in the way of doing that. So the concern to wildlife certainly is real and is an important part of where we locate these farms for those reasons. Trying to keep them out of certainly migratory bird routes and so when the siting of these units is an important part of ensuring that we protect wildlife in those areas. But I'd like to also point out that the turbines are getting bigger and bigger, which is what's driving costs down in wind energy. In land-based wind, of course, there's so much, you can't make them too big because you can't get them on the roads to build them. But in offshore wind, you can build these turbines, fabricate them near the water, and you can make the blades near the water and put them out there. And so that's why they've grown a lot. And as I said, some of these blades right now are turbines are in the 16 megawatt range. Mm-hmm. And that's a big turbine when we talk about 16 megawatt turbines. And that's what's driving the cost down. And what we found is that the larger the turbines are, the less of them you have to build, the less of them you have to get out, the less of them you have to maintain. The less time you have to throw them out and install them to the seabed, the less people to go out there and fix them when they go wrong. So the philosophy of the industry has been bigger is better and cheaper, but we've hit a plateau in many ways right now where industry is saying, well, wait a minute, we can't even handle these things. We don't have the cranes to lift them. We don't have the way to if you break blades, we can't replace them. And so there's a even though the blades, the rotors have become very big, as you said earlier, and the RPMs have come down, but we're getting to the point where the industry is thinking, well, maybe we need to pause a little bit here and stick with the 15, 16 megawatt range, so we can industrialize the systems and shake the problems out of them. So.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to, before we start talking back and forth amongst ourselves, be sure to pick up some of the questions that we've gotten posted online. And while we still have you on, Habib, there is, of course, a question about the stories about whales being affected by wind turbines, and how much truth is there in that, and what if there is, what kinds of turbines would be the ones that would be problematic?
From an environmental perspective, you mean?
Yes, in terms of the news stories about whales.
Oh, I see. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of misinformation out there on the impact of these turbines on whales, and in New Jersey, where there's claims that they've caused some whales to die. There isn't even any turbines out there yet. So so how could they be killing turbines if they don't even exist? But they're killing the whales. But there's a lot of misinformation. Certainly the NOAA, the National Oceanographic, and many other groups have come out and said there's no evidence that it's turbines that actually are causing some of the whale deaths. And they've actually went back and looked at some of the deaths. The majority of the deaths are caused by ship impacts right now. That's a lot of whales are being impacted by ships because of increased ship traffics and so forth, and that's the big issues. Certainly, what we try to do in our work is there's significant environmental ecological expertise on the majority of the teams that are working with us to ensure that we properly locate these farms, that we protect the environment. In terms of whale entanglement, there's some questions about can the whale be entangled in the mooring lines of these systems, and I showed you how big the mooring lines are. They look like a telephone pole. You're not going to get entangled in a telephone pole. So, but yeah, unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and that's certainly not supported by scientific evidence. So.
Thank you. One of the next questions I see is going back to Jay, that there's a question about the level of challenge in recycling solar panels. You're still muted.
There we go. That's something that the industry is very keenly aware of. A lot of the solar manufacturers are starting a basically cradle to cradle scheme where they say, once you purchase this panel, we will take care of the panel when it comes to the end of its life. So there are already processes that will recycle. I think it's 95% of the material that's within the solar panels. So I have seen some articles that have greatly overinflated just what the amount of waste that is potential there. They sort of take the exponential growth and then say, if all of these things happen at once, we're going to have an amazing amount of landfill. I just don't see that as a realistic problem. The materials that are harvestable out of those, the silver, the copper, the aluminum, those are pretty valuable materials and pretty easily recycled. So now some of the thin film types, that can be a little bit more problematic because there are some materials in the thin film panels that are being manufactured, and those have things like cadmium. So there's going to be a little bit more of a process there involved, but it's something the industry is dealing with, and these things do have a 25-year life expectancy. Well, they have a longer than that life expectancy. That's what their warranties are, 25 years. In fact, the very first solar array ever put in place is still operating in Germany. So, they just don't, if they fail, it's usually because of some sort of catastrophic event, like a hail storm or a truck driving into a ground-mounted system or something. And those can be dealt with pretty readily.
Okay, thank you. And Roland, there's a question about whether you have any ideas about lowering the costs of drilling geothermal wells. That I've seen an array of sometimes wild ideas about that, and I wonder if you have any thoughts about what
about drilling.
Yeah.
So there are some kind of wild ideas, people talking about, lasers and whatever else. But as it happens, there's been a lot of recent experience in geothermal drilling where they have successfully cut the drilling time in half, and actually in one case down to 1/3. And it wasn't by using, science fiction methods at all. It's basically by deploying oil and gas technologies into geothermal in ways that was different than had previously been done. And I should stress, first of all, there are some differences between oil and gas and geothermal. A different kind of rocks. Typically, geothermal rocks are much harder and more difficult to drill. They're also much higher temperature, so that can present some challenges. However, the technologies that have been developed in oil and gas with conventional methodologies actually have made advances that have also been applied recently to geothermal with very good effect. And I'm talking about PDC, polycrystalline diamond cutter bits, as well as the actual drilling methodology itself. Typically, geothermal wells didn't put a lot of weight on bit because they broke up their roller cones that way. But PDC bits actually are able to sustain much greater weight on bit, and that's translated to a greater rate of penetration. So it's quite true that drilling is one of the primary costs of a geothermal development, typically about half in most cases. So these kind of advances in drilling technology and drilling time, obviously the faster you drill it, the less it costs, is a huge plus to the geothermal acceleration.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to just kind of get some roundtable input from everybody, largely about how things fit together. What role can each technology play, and perhaps something about time frame as well.
Yeah, I've got a question for Roland, actually, if I could jump in there.
Mm-hmm.
I've been seeing a lot of articles about the lithium discovery down at the Salton Sea in Southern California. And my understanding is that's associated with geothermal production, that the brine that was being pulled up is actually laden with lithium. And I'm wondering, does that present a boon to the industry, or is that a challenge that's going to cause you problems? I mean, they're always saying it's the Saudi Arabia of lithium all of a sudden, and that sounds great, So is it true?
It is true that there is some congruence between lithium deposits, or actually mineral deposits of many kinds. The basic nature of geothermal fluids is that they're hot, and therefore, in most cases, they dissolve more minerals than cooler water does. And therefore, geothermal fluids tend to be elevated in concentrations of dissolved minerals, including lithium, as well as the fact that in a typical plant, there's excess heat available. So the process by which lithium is extracted can gain advantage from basically having a cheap, in many cases, free sort of source of thermal energy on site. And there have been several examples of lithium plants installed in geothermal fields. There's an operating pilot plant in the Salton Sea, probably for at least 5 years, maybe even 10, as well as in other parts of the world. You're completely right. There's a lot of enthusiasm for it right now, but the technologies at this moment are sort of in the beginning stages. So there isn't kind of a gold deposit of lithium in the Salton Sea specifically. It's kind of common in many geothermal areas.
Well, and maybe I can throw another question out to the group, but one of the things that's really impacting the solar industry from a large utility scale is the delays in interconnection agreements within the federal bureaucracy. And for instance, in PJM, they're saying they're not even going to look at them for 5 years. So how are we going to go through this energy transition if they're not even going to look at applications for a 5-year period? Is that something that everybody is dealing with?
I see Habib nodding.
Jay, misery likes company here, so we're facing similar issues in the offshore wind world in terms of trying to get them approved, if you wish. And there's a process where a project might take anywhere from 6 to 10 years before from a conception to execution. So it's a long time frame, if you wish, and Oftentimes, drilling for oil takes a lot less time than getting some renewable energy systems in the market. The federal government is working to try to remove some of these barriers right now and try to streamline some of these systems. But anytime you put an offshore wind farm that's got 50 turbines a mile apart somewhere in the ocean, you really have to do your homework. You've got to go out and collect data on the fish and the mammals and the birds and the bats, and so that takes time. And you've got to get to make sure that we're not interfering with other uses of the environment, whether it's fishing or recreational activities or military activities. So trying to get through all these, if you wish, steps is not simple. So yeah, I think we're sharing very similar. We're facing some very similar delays, Jay, that you see as well. So maybe not necessarily for the same reasons, but for other reasons. So.
Mm-hmm. And I see that we have 3 minutes left. So I want to see if there's any big points that anybody would like to make before we say goodnight. Or good morning, depending what part of the world you're in.
I would just make one philosophical remark, which I think perhaps came up earlier. This is not a contest between sources. It's a contest to deploy them all and actually solve the larger problem.
I'll give that an amen.
I must say I fully agree with you, Roland. And what's really important also is that wherever you are in the world, you may be richer in one of the resources versus another. And so, so if you look if you're in the Midwest of the United States, and anywhere from North Dakota down or Minnesota down to Texas, you've got the Great Plains and fantastic land-based wind in those areas. You go down further south, you get a lot more solar capabilities. You go to the coasts, then you've got more, you're restrained in land, but you can put offshore wind capacity. So I think where you are geographically is an important part of kind of the energy mix. The other piece also I'd like to add to that thought is pairing different renewable energy resources reduces our battery requirements significantly as well. So the battery cost, so if you're relying on solar alone, if you're in Maine, you're relying on solar alone, how are you going to store it from the summer to the winter and heat homes? But in the wintertime, our offshore wind speeds are 3 times what they are in the summer. So you can generate, 2 to 3 times, 8 times more energy sometimes, or per winter month than you do in the summer month. And that's when we need to heat our homes. So I think that, like you said, it's not really a competition between these renewable energy resources. It's more of a synergy and a geographic location where some of those resources might be more available to you or not. So it's So I think the menu is all the above, and depending where you are from the geography, one may be more prevalent for you than another. So,
yeah, I think another thing that all of us face at the moment, and it's growing, is political opposition to renewable sources. It's becoming politicized in a way that makes no sense to anybody except the politicians who are trying to politicize it. So that's something we're going to have to overcome.
That's so true, Jay, and thanks for bringing that up. And a lot of it is driven by entrenched interest rate, and we're in the status quo. So,
well, thank you. I think I definitely want to thank all of the participants. I know I learned a lot, even though I've been studying and writing about energy systems for 40 years now. And I think that we really, to a large degree, have a fairly hopeful perspective that we've shared today. And I think we have a lot of consensus that these are all pieces of a puzzle that fit together. And optimizing how we fit the puzzle together is the real challenge as we go forward. So I want to thank everybody very much. I appreciated everyone's input tremendously. To the audience, I'm sorry there are some of your questions that I wasn't able to get to, but I'll try to share them with the panelists to see if they have some things that they want to share offline to answer some of those questions. Thank you all very much and have a good evening.